All right, let's get going. Marilyn has just in effect introduced herself, so she saved me a minute there. If we want to go around for 1 second and say who you are, please, just let's keep it really quick because I want to get into the meat of it. But Marilyn, you are the co-founder of RE Technology and WAV Group, right?
Mhm.
And do a number of things. I don't think that covers it, right? Tim, you are go ahead, give the title.
CEO of Northstar MLS.
Right. And Colton,
I'm one of our co-presidents at Property Panorama.
gotcha. Sarah,
I am a real estate agent, realtor, founder of Bidwell Properties based in Washington, D.C.
fantastic. And I'm super stoked because it's my first time having an agent on. So thank you for joining. And I'm very excited about it because I feel like that's been a bit of a blind spot for us on some of these topics, is not having an agent's perspective. We talk a lot about agents. We don't always talk to agents. So imagine that. Although I'm sure Tim does all the time. So Tim's like, speak for yourself. So the topic is, what defines a neighborhood? So let's start with legally and through fair housing. What is a neighborhood? The legal definition of a neighborhood. Tim, I think you were going to quote something I found as well through real estate appraisers. I don't know if you want to quote that real quick.
Sure,
I have it
I'm
up as well, but
happy to.
let's talk about the
The
legal
most-
definition.
First, I'll say Tim Dain believes that a neighborhood is defined by the people that live in it, but
Mm,
real estate appraisers say a group of complementary land uses, a congruous grouping of inhabitants, buildings, and business enterprises. But wait, they go on to qualify that definition by saying a neighborhood's typically larger than a subdivision or a builder's development because neighborhoods normally include supporting businesses like neighborhood grocery stores. So there's your bland definition.
yeah. And that's a lot of the definitions that I found as well. I also like kind of Googled it, and that's sort of, these boundaries are include but not limited to streets, legally recognized neighborhood boundaries, blah, blah, blah. And then it says the appraisers, this is from Fannie Mae, appraisers should not reference a map or other addendum as the only example of the neighborhood boundaries, which is the part I thought was so interesting. Right. And even to our our folks who provide neighborhood boundaries, I thought it was interesting in that they themselves don't reference one specific place for a legal boundary. So I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that, but Marilyn, any ideas and thoughts on that too, as well as we go around the horn?
Well, I'm kind of with Tim. I feel like it's not necessarily people trying to move into a neighborhood because they may define it the way they want, and even not necessarily people trying to sell their home because they may define it as they want.
Yeah.
But those that actually live there, engage there, participate there, I do believe that's the group that probably has the best read. But I would love to hear from an agent's perspective on that too. That's someone that doesn't have to answer that question, first front line.
Yeah.
Certainly, there seems to be some tension between developers who are creating the mixed use, especially we see this in DC, the mixed use developments, and them renaming neighborhoods oftentimes. We now have NOMA in Washington, D.C.
Right.
They've tried Cohai, they've tried for Columbia Heights, that didn't
Yeah.
stick. And then what the people say a neighborhood is. I think the neighborhood of Capitol Hill is probably one of the best examples or illustrations I can give of this. What appraisers say Capitol Hill is not what the people say Capitol Hill is not what developers say Capitol Hill is. And when developers have tried to expand the boundaries of Capitol Hill, before it used to be strictly, from the Capitol to 6th Street, and then Eastern Market and Barracks Row got lumped into Capitol Hill. Harris Teeter came to town right on 9th and Pennsylvania, near government subsidized housing. And then all of a sudden that became Capitol Hill. But then the people kept pushing back, and then Hill East now became.
Right. Yeah, I
Um,
gotcha. No, that's a good point. And we'll get into that deeper too, in terms of who defines it. That's our next question. Before we move off the legal definition, again, Colton, like, does the appraiser decide? Does the company that provides the boundary decide? So let's go into the next question right away, because that was kind of a starter. Let's go into who defines it, right? We talked about this a little bit on the prep call, and we threw out some places like portals, MLSs, data provider, agents, consumers. I'll go to you, Colton. when
Yeah.
you're, and I think, look, part of the reason we have people like Colton that runs a B2B industry like ours is that we deal in neighborhoods and having to provide neighborhoods in an enterprise large scale in a big way. We're expected to understand what that is and to some degree be a source of truth, right, Colton?
Right. And who defines it's a great question. And Tim, you kind of pointed to it. It's the people within it. It's the community that combined with that geographical territory. And they are very fluid. You know, as Sarah mentioned, they're going to change over time. Whether, you know, if you're looking at unincorporated versus incorporated neighborhoods where they actually draw those physical boundaries, of course, that marks it. But when you look at like a housing development, where they can split, they can expand, they can be sold, you know, if they're, especially if it's rental units, things like that, and they're going to grow. And really it is who the people that move in and where they decide based on just kind of personal preference, how they're going to kind of label that location.
Yeah, so is it a point of just acceptance? To Sarah's point, and I'll give sort of dovetail if you'll forgive us, we're both in the same, live in the same area. Amazon came into an area called Crystal City, and Sarah probably all knew the new name, and they just decided the new name of this subsect of an area in the city was called Maple something. I don't remember what it's called now, Sarah.
National Landing.
Thank you. I said that so fast. And they just decided it's now called National Landing. So can you imagine you live in this area previously called Crystal City and it's now called National Landing because one company has moved in, a big one, but one, and that area has a lot of big companies actually, believe it or not, has Boeing there and they decide. So who does decide? Tim, when you're in your area, which is in Minnesota, how does it work for you guys? What do you do and how do you deal with it from an MLS perspective?
Well, I've been here a year, so I'll use St. Louis instead, just because.
Okay, fair
there are
enough.
more
Point take.
neighborhoods there. And
Totally
there's some
reasonable.
historic ones like the Hill, which was formed by Italians that migrated, you know, and over time.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the neighborhoods we think of have that historic quality to them, right?
Mhm.
But then I think they're like the area I lived in, I don't even know if we had a neighborhood name because it was just a city or a township. And so we used that name. But I think in a lot of ways, who decides is probably based on use case. So I'll speak from an MLS perspective, and I know that everyone shares my opinion that MLS boundaries, like what we used to call areas, need to go away. So there are still a lot of MLSs that have what you call an area, and you can go in and search by Area 52. And if you've been an agent in that MLS for 30 years, that makes a ton of sense to you because we didn't have necessarily the type of mapping capabilities we have today to draw on and everything else. So you predefine those and you did overlays. And in that scenario, the MLS got to decide, probably with a lot of input from the agents that were in the area back then. And they've sort of formed their use. They've expired. So I guess a lot of it's going to depend on use case since it's not a legal entity. It's who's using it for what purpose and how are they going to define it? And they come up with parameters. And interestingly enough, I'll throw in the other word community. I think they use their community of people to define the boundaries of the neighborhood for their use case.
Yeah, and we should have talked about that when we were talking about the definition because we talked about it a little bit on the prep call. The difference of a definition of a neighborhood versus a community versus a township. And I'll turn it to Marilyn in a second, but I did want to note that in the research that I did before this call that was so interesting, Tim, I meant to mention this to you a minute ago, was that a lot of the existing boundaries, to your point, are from like the 1970s and 1980s when urban planning was much more not developer, right? And not community based. And so there were, when you laid out a city, hence Capitol Hill, Sarah, right? You when the city was laid out, they would lay out certain areas and they became by de facto neighborhoods. Really, it was a lot of the urban planners. By the way, one last thing for our audience, please feel free to put up questions in the question section. I will probably save it to the end, but I will read them during. So please don't hesitate to ask us questions. Sorry, go ahead, Marilyn.
Yeah, I kind of question the going back to your point about community versus neighborhood, the appraiser definition that it includes the amenities. Because if I look at where I live, I'm in a distinct neighborhood built by a developer, right? There's another distinct neighborhood next door, which is much newer and arguably has higher end homes. If I tried to like tap onto their neighborhood, they'd be like, no, your house is 25 years old, mine's 2 years old. And vice versa, we'd be like, no, 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 you're not part of us. We've been here a long time, right? So
Right.
when it is a disparate, like there's a sign that says welcome to, and you drive in and you can drive out, like to me, that is a neighborhood. Where it gets a lot
Mm.
more money is when you're in a city. And again, people are trying to claim, like St. Petersburg's a great example, right? So downtown St. Petersburg has become this hot, young, hip place to go for restaurants and bars and all kinds of great, high-rise condos and whatever else. But there's people that are pushing that boundary up 10, 12 blocks, which is kind of, frankly, a little bit more of a sketchy neighborhood, not high end, not these $1 million condos that are downtown. And so I don't know. I mean, to me, I would go back to what we said. The people that live there, that understand how the patterns work, if you will, for lack of a better name, are the ones that should really decide.
But but we've all been through this. You pass it. I've heard from MLSs that let their agents do it and said it was an
Nightmare.
unequivocated total nightmare and disaster, right?
Yeah.
So
Almost the
Great.
consumer. It's like the actual consumer, to Tim's point, the one that actually lives there.
but that's no different than an agent doing it. Come on.
No,
Like,
they'll
yeah.
argue with you too.
Yeah.
And again, they'll still want to pull themselves into Capitol Hill. They think that's a higher end neighborhood than wherever they are now. So it is very, very difficult. It's almost, and I don't know if RISO has a role here, but it's probably another one to throw
That's
into the mix,
interesting. That's an
Yeah,
interesting. Go ahead. Yeah.
right? We
Good
have
enough.
data standards. We have data
Yeah.
standards, and I don't even know if
Oh,
there's
that's an interesting question, actually. I'll run it to Sarah. Go ahead, but that's
is there a
interesting.
RISO data standard for what a neighborhood
I
and
don't
or
know. We'll see when we go to
is?
reset. We'll raise our hand.
Yeah, so I think that could be an interesting one to say is there a quote governing body that maybe takes input from all
Well,
of
there's
these?
that they do it for data fields. Why wouldn't they do it for neighborhoods? But
Right, so
will they be presented with the same problem? Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, so I am part of Bright MLS here in the Metro Washington, D.C. area. And we actually, as agents, as listing agents, we have two fields. There is the legal subdivision, which is pre-populated to my knowledge. And then there is another designation for just subdivision, which you can edit and manipulate as an agent. So it gets a little bit tricky sometimes because in a city like DC where there are not geographical boundaries, it's not like we have all these gated communities or, like an HOA or even a neighborhood where it says, welcome to Cherrydale, a neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia, or welcome to
We got you.
yeah. So I find that gets a little bit tricky sometimes when agents get a little overly zealous about wanting to appeal to more buyers. And I think agents do this because there are buyers who search, in the age of like Redfin and Zillow, who search on their own for neighborhoods. They're not looking at specific geographic, they're not like taking an Etch-a-Sketch on a map.
No. And it's interesting because I've been in this industry way too long and certainly did a lot of website support. And I'm going to go to Colton next on this because this is a pain point, I'm sure, for Property Panorama, which is that it used to be, Sarah, the holy grail was that you could just draw the polygon. And as long as you could draw the polygon, you were good. And that was it. You guys are old enough, to some of you, to remember that it was all about custom polygons. And it's not to say people don't use still custom polygons, but the truth of it is to your point, the consumer wants to be told, not figure it out. What about you, Colton? How does this affect your stuff?
So we focus mostly on the data fields, obviously, and neighborhoods are omitted more often than not, but we do have a lot of agents that try to incorporate them. And it's largely the Wild West for all the reasons we just mentioned. Nobody really knows how to define it, and there's really nobody checking their work. And it's hard to police it, and almost impossible to, unless you have an uproar from the local neighbors saying this house isn't there, why are you marketing it? But it's just not something you're going to see very often come through.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree with Sarah too, that let's move into the name of the neighborhood even, which is the next step of it, right? Okay, so we've defined, look, what we've established so far is that the definitions of a neighborhood, and certainly this is at least true for the US, so I should probably be specific, but it's true to the US, is that the definition of a neighborhood is somewhat established by urban planners from a long time ago, and then there's appraisal definitions, and then we know that that developers are having a hand in a neighborhood. Maryland is like, if there's a sign out there, it's a neighborhood. I don't know. You know what I mean? I know it gets tricky, right? We know agents can't do it per se because that's, as bad as consumers doing it, really. So, and then it's the name, right? So then it goes to the name. Who decides, no different than my example with Amazon, right? That they suddenly walk in, they build a building, and they decide it's a new neighborhood. And it's marketing, right? So I don't know if you want to speak to that, Tim, a little bit when you were at St. Louis and about names of neighborhoods and dealing with agents calling and saying that's not the name of that neighborhood.
It's interesting because, and Sarah brought it up, the way Bright handles it is the way that a lot of MLSs handle it, because at the MLS, you're looking for factual data that can be verified, right? So you're typically connecting to public records, you're pulling that in. The definition of a neighborhood, let's say the neighborhood's name is Ebbets Field, you're not going to get that in public records. You're going to get EBF 187 extension 2, right? And that's what gets populated. And I would guess that Bright and probably many other MLSs don't even try to police the freeform type neighborhood field because it is too subjective. So to name drop real quick, Sam DeBoer, the CEO of RISO, if you happen to see a recording of this, do not try to standardize the name field in RISO. I just think it's a pointless effort that we will chase our tails on, because they are so subjective, right? And they're not legally defined in any way. There's nothing that I can do to tell Sarah she's wrong if that house across the street isn't in Cherry Point. Like, she can probably cite 20 different ways and get 5 different homeowners to tell me that the homes on that side of the street are in Cherry Point.
Can I play devil's advocate for a second, Tim?
Sure.
Is there nothing that RISO is standardizing that is subjective?
Okay.
Anyway,
let's
move on.
Other topic here that you
Let's
need to
move
invite
on,
Sam
shall
to
we?
talk about.
You're welcome, Marilyn. Okay, so mic dropped. Okay. I mean, that's the whole point of this conversation, right? This is about real estate, and real estate is subjective, much of it. It's sort of why it will forever be the Wild West of industries to some degree. We're always trying to tame the beast, right? A little bit. So I hear you, and I do agree with what you said, Tim, in that it would be a nightmare to probably try and do it, but aren't we doing it elsewhere? So again, who defines a neighborhood? When you see it, Sarah, more often than not, for names of neighborhoods, to your point about, and we don't need to drop a million DC ones because that I love it, but when your experiences, when you hear about a new name of a neighborhood like Kohai or whatever, or Noma, who did that? Do you ever ask yourself? I asked myself, by the way, when Adams Morgan became Noma, or whatever, and actually Admo, damn it, I knew it. Shoot. But like, didn't you ask yourself, like, who decided, like
The blogs, local blogs, Instagrammers, influencers.
And how do you keep up let me ask you a question. How do you keep up as an agent with the different neighborhood names and decide which ones resonate? Because, when you're marketing.
Well, the people are going to let you know through your paid advertising online whether the neighborhood the names that you're floating on there are going to stick or not. I know that a lot of local real estate websites, in the age of blogging back in 2007, et cetera, more people are connected through, Facebook groups and Nextdoor and other things, and Instagram now. TikTok even, but Urban Turf, Popville, those were some popular blogs back in the day.
Back in the day.
And a lot of consumers are still, a lot of buyers
are
still on those blogs, but I actually have a listing right now. This is like another prime example of how this plays out, with boots on ground. It is in the legal subdivision of Petworth, which is a desirable neighborhood for many DC buyers. It's in Northwest DC, but I have this listing that's just been sitting on the market for 2 weeks now, which is surprising for Petworth, where the average days on market is like 14 days last I checked. And it's because buyers keep saying this is Brightwood. And matter of fact, we are like 2 blocks away from the Brightwood neighborhood. So it really is interesting, even with all the legal designations of a Petworth, a desirable title. It's really the people who are deciding
Well,
Brightwood.
Well, you know
what makes them want to decide? We're going to go into that topic in a minute. Go ahead, Tim.
You know what's interesting though, and like I've got a few different thoughts here. One is, Sarah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I live in a land of 10,000 lakes, and if my grass is connected to grass that has a tree that fell and a leaf of that tree touches the lake, then that house is now lakefront property, right? So there is this whole 2-block boundary, and now it's part of that neighborhood. But what's interesting about that is that when I was doing a little bit of looking around at different websites, I'll reference the most popular, which is Zillow, right? You go to the neighborhood tab there, you know what you don't find? The name of a neighborhood. You find walkability, you find, scores on school ratings, you find those things, you don't find the name of a neighborhood. That's
Well,
probably
it's so funny. You're teeing me up for my one plug. I get one plug per class. And you just put it, you did it perfectly. I couldn't help myself. We did just launch a product called Neighborhood Intel, where people can actually pull a neighborhood report, and we do say the name of the neighborhood. And we do actually try and give people a sense of exactly, like, it's a Carfax for the neighborhood, of a snapshot of the neighborhood, who lives there. We do show the boundary, the whole thing. It's short, has nothing to do with the property. So it's not like RPR's report. It is really totally about understanding where you live. Because look, this whole conversation, how much money did CoStar spend? Everybody knows on the Super Bowl, $1 billion. And a lot of those ads were all about the neighborhood, because finally, people understand, whether it's because of COVID, we've said this in a lot of other master classes, you live where you work and you work where you live. So, Colton, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, but I know you guys also address in your product, this is your plug, but we do, we are a neighborhood company. That is what we do. That's why we're happy and open to discuss this. Go ahead, Colton.
The big thing with it that we try to do in our product is just give the agents the ability to, and that's InstaView, Property Panorama for my plug, the ability to give their consumers all that data in kind of a, I guess, undefined state, give them the original data fields from whether it's at the MLS or a third party, and allow their consumers to kind of make their own judgment calls. And one of the things that actually I meant to, is kind of on the last point there with Sarah, is you mentioned kind of the social aspect of defining those neighborhoods. And I found that interesting because it took me back to one of actually my recent few home purchases, where one of the first things I did was hop onto Facebook and look at the neighborhood groups for all those towns. And you learn the name there, and you also get a very good cross section of really who's in that area. And I still do that. I'm still members of all the last 6 different places I've lived, and I follow them all and watch the gossip. But
yeah, that actually, that was the whole premise of Nextdoor, right? Was to bring you closer to the people in your neighborhood or your community. And then I should have probably asked my buddy over at Nextdoor to join, and see how they define it. Where do they draw the lines, to be invited or not? I mean, I think technically to join Nextdoor, you just have to put in an address, and they decide what neighborhood or what group you go into. So that's interesting. Let's move to the next topic, which is, why is it important? I mean, should we just state the obvious, right? And let's all be aware of why it's important for the neighborhood. We know, number one, it's the money, but let's kind of address fair housing a little bit, and how fair housing comes into play with defining a neighborhood. I'm gonna go to Sarah first, because again, boots on the ground, and acutely aware of fair housing. How does that work?
Oh boy.
And Sarah suddenly has dropped off the call. She's had some connectivity issues.
So certainly we want to respect, the fair housing laws. We want to respect our code of ethics, right? And so I with every single home buyer consultation, I say this kind of tongue in cheek, but it's actually very true. I say all the things that you care about in a neighborhood, I can't talk about. That is crime, especially in a city like DC. We're seeing a spike in crime. Schools, I can't talk about that, so as not to
economic factors,
race, class, all the things.
Yeah.
So
all the things people care about.
all the things that affect people's daily life, sense of safety, sense of
Yeah.
belonging, sense of community, I cannot talk about. And so
Yeah.
this gets especially tricky when I work with out-of-town clients, which, you know, in a city like DC,
Yeah.
a
Yeah,
ton
you
of.
get a
So
lot of
we've
reload.
had to find other resources for them, where they can get the real. I always want to give my clients the type of service I would want from a real estate agent, right? And to get that real snapshot, I encourage them to join Facebook groups, you know, like Colton had mentioned, so that they can see all the good, the bad, the ugly. It's a bit overwhelming, and I prepare them for that. But yeah, I always want people to walk into any situation with their eyes wide open, because I say this again, at every home buyer consultation, you can change almost anything about a home. You can't change a neighborhood as easily.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
buy into a neighborhood before you buy into a home. So you really
No.
need to get clear and focused on what neighborhoods you want to focus on.
I would like to, I love that comment. I'm queuing that up for my marketing person. You buy into a neighborhood before you buy a home. That's great. And is a nice plug for, again, for our product of Neighborhood Intel, which is simply that it is a snapshot. And by the way, it does abide by fair housing, which is, I think, why we're doing so well with it. Because I think, and I know it's a shameless plug, but it is true, because when we developed this product, we got that question over and over again. So simply saying, you know, Marilyn and Tim, either one. Marilyn, you want to go first this time?
Well, I love the way that you position your role, Sarah. I think that's awesome. And it's a very well-educated and well-supported. Like when we do market research, we'll hear consumers say, I appreciate my agent's knowledge, but I feel like sometimes they're steering me. And I don't think they mean that in the
Yes.
definition of steering, but it's like, oh, you don't want to be here because of whatever. And
That
they're
happened to
trying
me.
to
Yeah.
support it, right? They're trying to be educational. They're not trying to truly steer someone, but
Yeah.
you have to be really careful with that stuff today. And when we look at all these lawsuits, you know, a lot of what we're getting gigged for is what people believe is a lack of transparency. I do not believe it clearly myself, but it doesn't matter, right? There's $5.4 billion out there that says that I'm wrong. So I think the idea of doing exactly what Sarah's talking about is you can still have resources you can point them to, like you say, a Nextdoor or public records documents in the county or whatever it might be, or school records somewhere else. But I think we all have to be really cognizant of, number one, fair housing, absolutely, but also providing as much transparency as we can without overstepping our role. And
I
that's
agree.
exactly what you're describing, Sarah, which is great.
And I saw it on the site yesterday. I was looking at this, and this data was not provided by us. It's on the website, and I was just looking at it, and it said the schools, and it had like a little star system, like it looked like it was a Yelp system, right? And
Mhm.
and I was like, thank God it wasn't us, because candidly, I was like, where's this? Normally, sometimes grade schools provides a lot of, as we know, and the way grade schools came into being is people did want feedback on schools. But the way they were able to do it is say this parental feedback. There is no system where hands off. We simply invited parental feedback, right? And this site had no reference to grade schools, nothing. So I'm like, how are you doing this? Like, you can't reference your source. That's a problem. Tim, do you have any thoughts on this about it, or how you deal with it with your member?
I think that the reality is this, look, our industry has a long history, a long unfortunate history of things like redlining, steering. We even have, you know, documents that supported it if you go back far enough. It's kind of sickening to think about now, but it's true. And it's not all in the history. I mean, it was just 2 years ago that the Long Island report came out, right? So there is a certainly a prevalence of agents that are doing and saying the wrong things, albeit intentional or unintentional. And I think that's the message here. I'm by no means a fair housing expert, but I think there's subjective and objective information that an agent could provide, and they need to avoid one and embrace the other. And so there are sources, there are community sources for policing activity, for crime rates, for things like that, that are government sources that I think agents can easily point people to, right? They don't have to comment on them, they don't have to talk about them, but finding those trusted sources or verifiable sources, I think is the right way to go with those kind of questions. And I think Sarah tees it up really well too.
Well, and
Say,
I think
I
that's,
can't talk
yeah.
about it, but I can show you where it's at.
No,
Mhm.
I think that's right. And I do think that's right. And I do, again, I'm sorry, but I do think this is what we're trying to do with our report, which is that, look, it's not the agent is simply providing a source. To your point, if an agent provides a data source of information, us or anybody else, through a report, are they then, they're not steering, right? They're simply providing objective information. I do think that the fair housing and the steering, and I do think a commenter made agents do steer, they do steer, they do. And then the question is, why do agents steer? So let's get to that in 1 second. But is providing data about a neighborhood and simply saying is not steering, it's objective information from a third party.
Right.
Period.
It
That's
becomes
it.
steering when I hand you 2 reports and I go, when you read these, you're going to realize this one's obviously better
Right.
because of X, Y, and Z, right?
Yeah, right. Well,
I
and
think
I
it comes
think,
down.
look, steering is driving to a certain neighborhood and saying you should look here, right? For XYZ reasons. Sorry, go ahead, Colton.
I think it comes down to that agent interpretation. Once the agent starts interpreting that data is where they're going to run into problems. And even past that, it goes back to that original point we had of the community versus the geographical neighborhood. When an agent starts defining a community, what the people that make it up is where they're going to obviously hit that wall and have to kind of pull back on what they discussed. But when they're providing that data, and that's what I said, look, with our product, just giving them the ability to attach all that content and say, here it is, it's all in
Make your own
front of you,
decision.
make your objective, decisions on it.
Exactly. So let
Well,
me
what-
let me talk about something else then before, and Marilyn, I have a feeling you'll want to talk about this. So let me throw this out first and then say what you want to say. This is also, at what point does the neighborhood steer the value or does the value steer the neighborhood? Let's take the agent and all of that out of it. So for instance, to Sarah's point, if you're in this DC neighborhood and everybody starts talking about it, blah, 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 suddenly it's a place people want to be. Is the, what is steering gentrification? Is the neighborhood and the marketing of the neighborhood steering ultimately gentrification or cyclical factors? So go ahead, Marilyn. Yeah, that's sort of where I want to go next.
That's a long conversation too.
I
mean,
know,
it's
but
different
we
in
have another 5 minutes or so.
every single situation. I mean, I was mentioning on the prep call, I saw this in Buffalo with actually a friend of mine who there was a neighborhood that was the, sort of the prostitution red light district. He built this, not even a building, but this beautiful well-lit parking lot, looked very professional. And the next thing you know, it was like it got people's attention to that neighborhood and it was the catalyst to create the gentrification. Now it's like the hot spot to go down, go to all the kids go to the bars and restaurants and whatever. It became a fun area. So I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of times it is somebody does something, usually a developer or contractor of some sort that steers that's the wrong word, not steers. It just creates a catalyst for it's time. This is going to be something different. And once
Well,
people start to work, then others jump on. And the next thing you know, the neighborhood is completely different. But just quickly back to the steering conversation.
yeah.
One of the things that I hear a lot again in consumer research is the word steering is a good thing and a bad thing, depending on what they're telling you, right? So if I'm an agent, and I'd love to hear your perspective of this, Sarah, if I'm listening intently and you tell me your criteria is this, 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 and this, and this, and I know the neighborhoods that fit those things, I don't mean demographics and things like that, but distance from my office as an example. Like in my case, I wanted no more than 20 minutes from the office. I wanted an ocean view because I'd flown, moved 3,500 miles. I wanted to see the ocean. And there were a couple of other things, right? And so they steered me away from a neighborhood that was 45 minutes away because that was within my criteria. So where's the line between the agent's desire to satisfy what their clients are asking for versus steering them to something they believe makes sense for them? I don't know.
It depends on how clear the consumer is on the criteria, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Sarah, is that kind of what you see in your experience?
As an agent, I often feel like I'm just holding up a mirror to my clients and saying, this is what you said. Is this still true? And we have like our checklist. We have a very, set process, an intake process, right? Because I talk about the 85% rule. Does this mean 85% of your criteria before you even get out the door and into that other home to tour it? So yeah, oftentimes it's like holding that mirror up to them when it is in regards to transportation times, proximity to things like certain like your work, your workplace or metro or what have you, it's easier to talk freely about that. But when it comes to anything having to do with a protected class, that's when it gets a little bit turbulent, and we're not permitted to steer when it comes to anything having to do with a protected class or things having to do with crime, which, as a mom myself, as a female who lives alone 50% of the time, I have a really difficult time when I have a buyer client who wants to buy a home because it's the most accessible price point. But I've lived in Washington, D.C. proper since the year of our Lord, 2003. And I know what goes on in this little neck of the woods. And it's a little dicey, right, when it comes to crime. All the locals know this. And so that's personally, like on a human level, I have to stop myself from steering. I have to show every buyer every home that they actually want to see and meets their criteria. But this is why it's important for me to say, hey, you want to look into, I just push them to look into the resources that they have. You're going to want to look at the Facebook groups, and you're going to want to talk to somebody here if you're not familiar with this area. I'm happy to connect you to local residents. I'm happy to connect you to a local parent or a teacher at one of the schools that you have your eye on, so that you can get, I call it the real, just like unfiltered commentary from actual residents and neighbors who would be happy to, share their feedback. Like, clearly they live here, so I don't expect them to.
That's helpful. I mean, I want to go back to Tim or Colton on a little bit on, I feel like we're going down the rabbit hole with steering a little bit, although it's interesting. And I do think it relates directly to neighborhoods and is really about the issue to some degree. It is the core of it, let's face it. And steering is about, to some degree, gentrification and value. So I think for Colton or Tim want to jump in, but look, steering, gentrification, whatever, this is all about money. One side of the road is, this amount of money, and the other side of the road is the other amount of money, whether it's because of schools or crime or any other factor that we're not supposed to talk about from a fair housing perspective. So I don't know, like, if you guys have any thoughts on that and how you deal with that. I know we're about winding up. So thoughts on that, Tim?
I'll jump in. Sure. I mean, you're right. It's about money, but I think it's about two things, right? It's money or politics, right? Because
that's true too.
From my perspective, there's like four big buckets where you can put value of a home into, right? It's the economic, social, governmental, and maybe like the physical factors, right? So I noticed earlier, I looked through the list, and I noticed Jeff Bosch is on here, and he's out in Colorado, right? So topography.
You can't do that.
Well, but topography certainly impacts the home value, right? A home in the mountains versus a home in,
Sorry,
the middle
Jeff.
of flat Iowa, right? There's going to be two different values there based on those physical factors of like topography or even water contamination or air pollution or noise pollution if you get into a city area. And then economic factors like, one of the newer ones that impacts value of a neighborhood is how many short-term rentals are there, right? So that's it's a really interesting evolution of impacting neighborhood value in terms of like the economic factors. What are the labor costs there? What are the current interest rates? Certainly impact, what's the value of that home? So I think there are a lot of, from the political side, though, you've got to think about all the different municipality codes, local government, national government. What's impacting the built environment there? Is it easy to get permits to build homes, or does it take you 12 months and a massive investment to get a new community off the ground if you're a builder? That's going to impact the value of the home.
Yeah, builders have a huge hand. We say developers and builders, maybe they're in the same pocket. I do want to ask, and maybe you can take this one, Colton. I know we're about winding up, but I did get a great question in that I really like. So if it's okay, I'm going to throw it to the group real quick. Hypothetical: if an agent is found through a resource that queries steering, i.e. class, crime, ethnography, etc. search, are they still guilty of steering for advertising their service on a platform where the home buyer queries this? So that's an interesting point. And I make this point because Homes.com, our lovely friends at CoStar, actually are for the first time showing crime on a portal. And that's considered, by the way, like absolutely krypton to the industry. First ones to do it. It was like when flood first went up on sites. Everybody was like, no, not flood. And then demographics, which is all fair housing and census, and everybody's like, no, not demographics. And now they put up crime, and now they've really broken the seal. So I think it's such an interesting question, Colton, right? Which
Yeah.
is, but
It's
we're talking a
the
lot about whether or not Coursera is steering. Are the sites by the nature of themselves steering, and therefore is it not steering at all? Because what we're really trying to do is help a consumer find where they want to live.
yeah, the first off, I think on my side of things, I'll say I don't believe that they are in a lot of ways, but kind of speaking as far as what you can defend, it's the 6 degrees of separation, from the
Yeah.
agent. It's kind of the same argument that a lot of agents face when you're looking at like branding regulations. If you put out marketing and you in some way allow it to point back to the listing agent, you violate branding regulations. If an agent sends a link to a potential buyer that has that content on there, that they can access those reports, that data that does steer them in a certain direction. At what point is that of the agents doing? And again, it comes back to, I think, that if they're providing their own opinion, because Sarah mentioned earlier, she said kind of jokingly that all the information you want, I can't give you. So when you're talking about a neighborhood and a community, what a buyer really is looking for in a lot of ways is an opinion on all of those things that you're not allowed to tell them. And
Yeah,
they have to kind of build that from their own. With my experience, I moved a couple moves ago into an area that I wasn't familiar with. And my agent at that time, when I walked in, had seemingly never been there and was really unable to give me anything other than, hey, this is a nice place. Thanks. I think it is too. I just came here for the first time, just like you. And it's very interesting with that experience versus other agents. This is the difference of knowledge of an area and what an agent can provide when they do have insight into just anything that you as a buyer may or may not know when you're moving across the country, thousands of miles away like Maryland was.
well, you teed me up again. Sorry, can't help it. That's just why we're finishing an agreement, as Tim knows, with Northstar, and we've just went live with some other MLSs to have our data available for exactly that reason, which is that, to be honest, agents should be able to go into the back end of the system and be able to speak to a neighborhood in an educated way, before they hit the consumer. Because if it's funny, because out of DC area, my son was moving, and I have an agent who's a friend who's lived also like this, Sarah, right, all her life, but it's 10 miles down the road at Chantilly versus Centerville. The truth is, she doesn't know what it's like to live to one versus the other, but she could have gone into the back end system and said, hey, it looks like this is very walkable, and speak to it in an intelligent manner, because it sucks otherwise. It's a crappy experience. It's hard for the agent. They got a nice referral, and it's hard for the consumer because they want to use that agent, but they want to use that agent not just because they're a local expert for the street they live on, but for the area they work in. Let's face it. And nobody wants to lose a lead if you're an agent, right? And truth be told, the consumer doesn't want to call 3 other people and looking for who's the true neighborhood expert. A true neighborhood expert, in my humble opinion, is the agent that does the work to become one. Right? I mean, it's your job, Sarah, right, to serve all the different neighborhoods in DC and to become educated. Even if you live in Noma, and I talked to you about Kohai, you should be able to talk to the difference, in my humble opinion.
Yes.
Any last words besides mine on this? And we'll give everybody 10 minutes back. We've had some great questions and feedback, so thank you everybody to be joining.
I want to
Tim,
correct the
I
record
knew
on
it was
one
going to
thing.
be
Yeah,
you.
I don't want to become a portal defender, but correcting the record, homes.com isn't the first. Matter of fact,
Okay, I don't mind that.
realtor.com had it years ago, and I believe they removed it around 2022 in support of fair housing. Because,
Really?
and even
I
saying
don't
this
remember
makes
Realtor
me,
having it.
well,
I was there in
saying
that
this makes me
period.
cringe a little bit, but I think the reason they gave for removing it was that they wanted to support fair housing, and the quote had something to do with not penalizing Black and Latino communities by displaying crime maps on their website. And just saying that kind of makes me cringe that maybe that quote wasn't
Well,
good, but
this is
yeah,
where it gets so ugly. Like, is a walk score a like, you know what I mean? Like, we do
yeah.
walkability and things. We're more careful about it. but you're right, it gets messy. It gets, and it kind of brings us full circle to the bottom line is what we've discovered on this webinar is there are a number of legal resources to determine a neighborhood. We probably have no choice but to use them, and we use them, and we are the source of them in Canada, and we use a variety of data sources, and we're proud and we stand by them. And in the meantime, as far as marketing and feet on the street for people like Sarah, they're going to say, here's the legal resource and what's typically defined as this neighborhood, and have to keep up with it and try not to be candidly swayed by every little thing that some developer comes in and decides Crystal City is National Landing. And by the way, on that anecdote, nobody locally calls it National Landing. Nobody. Go ahead, Sarah. You're gonna
Well,
you can
it's
shoot me
power
down
to
one
the
more
people.
time too.
Power to the people. I do not think Jeff Bezos could have done that or would have even done that if there were neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods and subdivisions in Crystal City. For those of you who are not local, Crystal City is largely a lot of government contractors. The private sector is located there. There are hotels. If you've got a convention in Washington, D.C., you're probably staying at the Marriott or the Holiday Inn.
Not a lot of single family.
Not a lot of single family homes, a couple high-rise apartments and condos, but that's it. There's not a whole lot of residential vibrancy in that neighborhood. Had there been, residents
wouldn't
in
have been
that
able to
neighborhood,
do
they
it.
would have protested that. Everybody would have like rallied to cancel their Amazon Prime subscriptions or something until Jeff Bezos changed his mind. But
Well, there you go. I like it. We'll end it on power to the people. I mean, can't get a webinar any better than that, right? I mean, so neighborhoods are the power to the people to both their benefit and to their detriment, right? So thank you guys all for joining. It was spirited and interesting as I had hoped it would be. And I don't really know what the next masterclass topic is yet, so I'm not going to announce it because I'm still thinking about it. And if you've got some good suggestions, feel free to reach out to me and throw them my way. All right. Thanks, everybody. Happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
Fill your neighborhood with love. Had to be said, Marilyn. It just had to be said. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.